Story 1. My name is Sarah Reynolds. I decided to do something completely different. Rent a small, isolated cabin in the countryside. The cabin was simple, but exactly what I wanted. Rustic wood, large windows that let in natural light, and an incredible view of a dense, green forest. I chose that place because it seemed perfect for a moment of introspection. My plan was to stay for a month, work remotely on my laptop, do some watercolors, my secret hobby that I always put aside because of work, and just rest. In the first few weeks, everything seemed like a dream. I woke up to birdsong, had coffee on the wooden porch, watching the morning mist dissipate between the trees. But something would completely change this tranquility, something I could never imagine. In the third week, I started to notice something strange. Always around 3 in the morning, there would be an old, almost rusted streetlight just beyond the edge of my property. At first I thought it was just my tired imagination, but the scene repeated itself every night with almost surgical precision. The light from that streetlight blinked in a completely irregular way, sometimes faster, sometimes slower, as if it had a life of its own. It was an unsettling flicker, one that made me freeze beneath the sheets, my heart beating so loudly I could hear it. And then, in those intermittent blinks, something completely gave me goosebumps. Every time the light blinked, I could clearly see the silhouette of a person standing right under the streetlight. A motionless, dark figure, without defined contours, but definitely human. It wasn't just any shadow. It was something that seemed to be watching me fixedly, without moving a single millimeter. The following nights, I spent awake waiting for that moment, between fear and a morbid curiosity that consumed me completely. I confess that I started to become obsessed with that scene. During the day, I searched every inch of the land trying to find any evidence of that post. But it was as if he simply didn't exist. The grass was intact, without concrete marks, without any trace that anything had been installed there. My neighbors, who were very few in that area, seemed to have no idea what I was talking about. When I mentioned the post to the owner of the nearby inn, he just looked at me with a strange, somewhat disconcerting smile and quickly changed the subject. The nights became a ritual of terror. I literally timed it. At 2:55 a.m., I was already glued to the window, my heart pounding, my fingers trembling holding a cup of tea that was quickly cooling. And promptly at 3 a.m., there was the streetlight, the light blinking, that motionless figure staring at me. I began to notice details that disturbed me. The figure seemed to be a different height on some nights. Sometimes it seemed to be almost 2 meters long. Sometimes it seemed to be the size of a child. But always standing still, always watching me, always in the same place. I decided I needed proof. The next night, I prepared my professional camera, the one I used to record my architectural projects, and strategically positioned it close to the window at maximum zoom. My plan was to document that figure, to prove to myself that I wasn't going crazy. I placed the camera on the tripod, adjusted the setting to capture images every 5 seconds during the fateful time, and tried to remain calm. But nervousness consumed me inside. My hands were sweating and I could barely breathe properly, imagining what I could capture. When I got close to the computer to check the images, my entire body shook. Of the 30 photos taken that night, 28 were completely normal, just the dark forest landscape. But 2 photos were absolutely inexplicable. In the first, the silhouette was exactly as I always saw it, standing motionless under the lamppost. In the second photo, taken just a few seconds later, there was absolutely nothing. No poles, no figures, just the dark forest and some trees. It was as if something had simply disappeared in the blink of an eye. It was a Friday, and the tension was already completely consuming me. I spent the whole day without sleeping properly, revisiting those 2 photos on the computer, enlarging each pixel, looking for some rational explanation. The figure in the first image seemed to have something different about it. I hadn't noticed it before, but now it was clear. It had no face. Where there should have been eyes, mouth, nose, there was only a completely dark and smooth area. As if someone had intentionally erased the features that night, I decided to do something that went against all my survival instincts. I decided to confront that figure. At 2:50 in the morning, I put on a thick sweatshirt, grabbed a powerful flashlight, and left the cabin. The cold bit my face, and the forest seemed different, quieter, denser. My every step was calculated, my eyes fixed on the spot where the post always appeared. My heart was beating so loudly that I could hear it in my ears, a kind of deafening drum that marked my every move into the unknown. When I reached the exact spot where the pole always appeared, my body froze. There was absolutely nothing there. No traces, no marks on the ground, no posts. The grass was perfectly even, as if it had never been touched. My brain tried to process that information, but it was as if something inside me was screaming at me not to let my guard down. I raised the flashlight, illuminating every inch of that space, and that's when something completely unexpected happened. The flashlight's light began to blink exactly like the streetlight. At that moment, I felt something that went beyond fear. It was a feeling that something was watching me, not just visually, but scanning me completely. The temperature around me dropped drastically. My breath came out in little white clouds, and I could feel every hair on my body standing on end. That's when I heard, or rather, felt, something that made me freeze. A whisper. It wasn't an audible sound. It was something that seemed to go through my mind, a kind of communication that didn't go through the ears, but directly through my brain. The whisper was incomprehensible, but it carried an urgency that made me shiver involuntarily. They weren't words, but sensations, fragments of thoughts that seemed to want to tell me something important. My mind worked frantically trying to decipher that message that was neither visual nor sound. It was as if someone was trying to communicate something to me through a frequency I could barely pick up, like a radio tuning to a distant, hazy station. I took a few steps back, my flashlight still pointed forward, but something completely changed in the environment. The darkness seemed to have gained a different texture, denser, almost palpable. That's when I realized that that figure, or whatever it was no longer standing still. She was moving towards me, not with steps, but as if gliding over the grass, without touching the ground. A fluid and absolutely unnatural movement that sent my entire body into a state of high alert. Approaching like that was something that defied all logic. It was neither a human nor an animal movement. It was as if a dark, undefined mass was moving through space, constantly changing shape. My muscles were completely locked up, a mixture of absolute terror and morbid curiosity that prevented me from simply running. My mind was screaming at me to move, but my body felt like it had been frozen in that exact moment, as if an invisible force was keeping me absolutely still. When the figure finally stopped, it was just a few meters away from me. It had no face, no defined shape, but I felt its eyes watching me with an intensity that went far beyond the physical. It was as if he could see inside me, searching every memory, every secret. A shiver ran down my spine, and at that moment I knew one thing for sure. It wasn't human. It wasn't something that could be explained by reason, science, or any knowledge I might have. Time seemed to have frozen at that moment. Suddenly, the figure began to dissolve, as if it were made of smoke or shadows. It wasn't an abrupt disappearance, but a gradual, almost delicate one. I instinctively backed away, my feet finally responding to the paralyzing terror. The next thing I knew, I was back in the cabin, the door closed, and I couldn't even remember how I got back. My mind tried to process what had happened, but it was like trying to hold water in my hands. It was running everywhere, shapeless, meaningless. The next morning, I decided I couldn't stay there. I called the property owner and said I needed to leave immediately. I didn't explain why. I knew it would sound completely absurd. As I was packing, I noticed something strange. A small dark mark on the pocket of my sweatshirt. Something that looked like it had been left by that figure. It was like a signature, a reminder that this had been real. No matter what others might think, I knew what had happened. The following week, after returning to Portland, Oregon, I began researching that region. I discovered something that completely chilled me. That area had ancient stories of strange appearances. Talking to a man who had lived in the region for decades, he told me about local legends of figures that appeared on poles, especially on new moon nights, in isolated places in the Atlantic forest. I didn't want to go back to that cabin, but something inside me knew that the story wasn't over. Time passed, and that experience was kept as a secret. Sometimes, when I wake up in the middle of the night and see some light flickering through the window, I get that same chill. I know that what I saw that night was not normal, it was not human. And no matter how much I try to rationalize, one thing I know for sure: there is something beyond what we can explain. Something that lives on the edges between the real and the inexplicable. And that figure, whatever it was, remains a mystery that I carry with me. If you like our stories, leave a comment and subscribe to the channel. Story 2. My name is Derek. My childhood friends and I, Matt, Brian, and Chris, go on a 3-day camping trip in this forest. It's a tradition that started when we finished college and we needed a moment to reconnect, as we each followed a different path in life. In 2019, however, something happened during our trip that completely changed my relationship with that place. It was our 5th time camping together and, as always, we set up base near Diamond Lake, one of the most beautiful spots in the region. We had arrived around 2 p.m. and spent hours fishing, drinking beer and catching up around the campfire. Around 11 p.m., I needed to move away from the group a little to pee. I went a few meters deeper into the forest, distancing myself enough to have privacy, but keeping the camp lights still visible between the trees. That's when I heard it. A scream that chilled my spine and made me freeze in place. It wasn't a coyote howl, or an owl hooting, or anything I'd ever heard in all my years of camping there. It was something between a human scream and an animal scream, high-pitched and prolonged, which seemed to come from all directions at once. The sound must have lasted about 15 seconds, but it seemed like an eternity. I ran back to camp and told the guys what had happened. As expected, they laughed and said that I was exaggerating, that it was probably just some animal from the region that I didn't know. Matt even joked that I must have had too much beer. I ended up letting it go, but that sound kept playing in my head for the rest of the night. I couldn't sleep well, tossing and turning in my tent and paying attention to every noise in the forest. The strangest thing is that throughout the rest of the camp, I didn't hear anything like that. The following days were normal, with our usual activities, and I returned home trying to convince myself that it had just been my imagination. A year passed, and in July 2020, we returned to the same place. I confess that I was a little apprehensive, but I didn't say anything to the boys. I didn't want to be embarrassed again. The first 24 hours were peaceful until on the second night, almost at the same time as the previous year, I decided to go get more wood for the fire. I was bending down to pick up some sticks when I heard it. The same scream, exactly the same as the previous year. But this time there was something different. Among the echoes of the scream, I could clearly distinguish a whisper that said my name, Derek. I dropped all the firewood I had collected and was paralyzed, feeling my blood run cold in my veins. There was no way someone was playing a trick on me. The sound was too unearthly, and my friends were all around the fire. I could see them from there. I ran back to camp completely in a panic. This time, when I told them, I noticed that they were a little uneasy, mainly because they saw the state I was in, pale, cold, sweating, and shaking. Brian suggested we check the area with flashlights, but we didn't find anything out of the ordinary. Chris tried to calm me down by saying it could be the echo of some distant sound playing with my mind, as we were in a valley. Matt was silent, and I noticed he was more serious than usual. Later, when we were alone getting water, he confessed to me that his grandfather, who was a forest guide in the region in the 70s, used to tell stories about inexplicable sounds in that area of the park. The rest of that trip was a nightmare. I couldn't sleep properly anymore, and with every noise from the forest my heart raced. Still, I tried to convince myself that they were just bizarre coincidences. The human brain has an incredible ability to create patterns where they don't exist, doesn't it? I spent the entire year researching the sounds of Oregon wildlife, local history, indigenous legends of the region, anything that could explain what had happened. I found some interesting stories from the Umpqua natives about forest spirits imitating human voices to attract travelers, but nothing specific about that type of scream. I also discovered that there were some unexplained disappearances in the area during the 1980s, but the cases were never solved. In July 2021, even after much hesitation, I decided to return with the group. Something inside me needed to understand what was happening. This time we came more prepared. Cameras, audio recorders, more powerful flashlights. The boys, even though they didn't completely believe my story, agreed to take the equipment seriously. The first night, nothing happened. In the second, too, we started to relax and even joke about all the equipment we had brought. But on the third and final night, around 11 p.m., everything changed. The scream echoed through the forest, louder than ever, and this time everyone heard it. Matt dropped his beer, Chris began to pray quietly, and Brian froze in place. But the worst was to come. Among the echoes, a voice that seemed to come from inside my own head began to speak. It wasn't just my name anymore. The voice knew things about me. He mentioned my late grandmother's name, Margaret, and cited the story she always told me before bed, about a golden deer that lived in the forest. He talked about the scar I have on my left knee, from when I fell off a bicycle when I was 8 years old. He mentioned details about my life that not even my friends knew. The voice wasn't threatening, but there was something deeply wrong about it, as if it were several voices speaking at once, some high-pitched, some low-pitched, some seeming to come from very far away, others from very close. That night, no one could sleep. We all huddled by the fire until dawn, with our flashlights pointed into the darkness of the forest. The recorder we had left on only picked up static and a low, steady hum. The cameras recorded nothing but the normal shadows of trees moving in the wind. It was as if what tormented us knew exactly how to avoid being recorded. Brian suggested that we break camp immediately and leave, but something told me that we needed to stay, that this thing, whatever it was, had a reason to be communicating with me specifically. The next morning, as we packed our things to leave, I found something that made my stomach turn. Near my tent, carefully arranged in a perfect circle, were several objects from my childhood that I had lost over the years. My first digital watch, which disappeared when I was 12, a toy car I lost in the park when I was 6, and even more disturbing, my grandmother Margaret's necklace, which disappeared on the day of her funeral. All the objects looked new, as if time had not passed them by. When I showed it to my friends, Chris threw up right there. Matt took photos of everything, his hands shaking so much that some of them were blurry. Brian, who had always been the most skeptical of the group, began to silently cry. I didn't tell this story to anyone other than my friends who were there, because I know no one would believe it. But since then, I started having strange dreams every night. In them, I'm always back in that clearing in the forest, and the voice, now clearer and more defined, tells me stories about things that happened in that place long before I was born. It talks about other people who heard the screams, about secrets buried among the roots of ancient trees, about a time when the forest was different. The most disturbing thing is that I wake up from these dreams with knowledge I shouldn't have. Names of people who lived in the region decades ago, locations of places I've never visited, details about historical events that aren't in any book. In September 2021, 2 months after our last trip, I received a letter with no return address. Inside there was just a black and white photo yellowed with age. It showed a group of men in antique clothing, posing in front of a gigantic tree that I recognized as being from the area where we were camping. On the back of the photo, a date, 1892, and there I was, or someone identical to me, among those 19th century men. Same eyes, same face shape, same birthmark near the right ear. I spent hours looking at that image, trying to find some sign of manipulation, some proof that it was a montage. But it was an original, old and authentic photo. The paper, the texture, everything indicated that it was actually more than 100 years old. The following months were a whirlwind. I started receiving more letters, all with no return address, containing old photos from different eras: 1923, 1945, 1967, and in all of them was me, without having aged a day. Some were accompanied by newspaper clippings about mysterious events in the forest region. Matt, who works in genealogy, offered to help me investigate. We discovered that my great-great-grandfather, Alexander Thompson, was one of the region's first rangers and mysteriously disappeared in 1891, a year before the first photo. In the last few weeks before he disappeared, his diaries, which we found in local archives, repeatedly mentioned a call from the forest and voices that knew too much. In January 2022, I received the last letter. It was different from the others. The paper was new, the ink was still fresh. Inside was a detailed map of the forest with a specific location marked in red, a few miles north of where we usually camped. Enclosed was a note written in handwriting identical to mine. "You know you need to come. It's time to understand." I showed the boys everything. Chris immediately refused to go back there, and I don't blame him. Brian said I would be crazy to follow that map. But Matt looked me in the eye and said he would go with me. He also wanted answers. We set the date. We will return in July of this year, 2024. I know it is risky, maybe even dangerous, but I need to know the truth. I need to understand my connection with that place, with those voices, with those photos. If anyone here on the forum has experienced something similar or knows of similar stories in the Umpqua region, please get in touch. Any information can help. In the end, everything turned out very differently than I imagined. In July 2024, Matt and I actually went to the point marked on the map. It was a denser area of the forest, where the trees were so close together that their branches formed a kind of natural roof, blocking almost all sunlight. We followed the exact coordinates and, after 2 hours of walking, we found something surreal. A perfectly circular clearing, as if it had been drawn with a giant compass. In the center of it was the same tree as in the 1892 photo, majestic and imposing. But the most impressive thing was what was around her. Hundreds of personal objects arranged in concentric circles. Watches, toys, jewelry, letters, photos, all belonging to different people, from different times. As we approached the tree, the familiar scream echoed through the forest. But this time I felt no fear. The voices all started speaking at the same time, and I finally understood. Each one of them was someone who, like me, had a connection to that place. The tree was a kind of guardian of the forest's memory, collecting stories and objects through time. My great-great-grandfather hadn't disappeared. He had become part of it, as had dozens of other people over the centuries. His voice was one of the ones I heard. He and the others had been chosen to protect something ancient and powerful that lived in that forest, something that needed human guardians to continue existing. The photos I received were a call, an invitation to join them. But unlike the others, I had a choice. My grandmother Margaret's voice, yes, She was there too, told me I could leave and never come back if I wanted. Or I could accept my place in that ancient history. Matt witnessed everything, recorded everything. He is the reason I can tell this story now. As for me, well, let's say if you visit Umpqua National Forest and hear a strange cry in the forest, maybe it's my voice calling out to the next guardian. If you like our stories, leave a comment and subscribe to the channel. Story 3. I never imagined I would move from New York to a small town in rural Maine, but after my husband Richard received an offer to work remotely that I couldn't refuse, we decided it was time to give our children a calmer life. The house we bought in Millbrook, the name we affectionately gave to our property, was everything we dreamed of. 3 bedrooms, a large backyard for the children to play in, and an incredible view of the hills that surrounded the area. For the first few weeks, we spent hours admiring the sunset from our balcony, while Emily and Josh, ages 8 and 6, ran around the lawn. The move felt perfect, and I finally felt like we had made the right decision. Even though the closest city was 40 minutes away, autumn was beginning, and the leaves on the trees were beginning to turn orange, making the landscape even more beautiful. It was one afternoon in October that I noticed something different. I was preparing dinner and, as usual, I was looking out the kitchen window that faced the nearest hill. It was about 300 meters from the house. At first I thought it was just a tree that I hadn't noticed before, but the more I looked, the more certain I was that it was a person. A tall, motionless figure, standing exactly at the top of the hill. Even from that distance, we could tell it was someone very tall and thin, and it seemed to be looking directly at our house. I tried to rationalize it. It was probably a neighbor taking a walk, although I'd never seen anyone there before. I called Richard to look, but when he got to the window, there was no one else there. He smiled and said that I must be seeing things. After all, we were all still adapting to the silence and isolation of the camp. As the days went by, that vision began to become more frequent, and I noticed a frightening pattern. The figure always appeared at the same time, around 5:30 p.m., when the sun began to set. I began to look more closely and noticed that she was wearing what looked like a long, dark coat. But the details were difficult to make out against the evening light. The most disturbing thing was that she never moved. She stayed there, still, for about 20 minutes, always in the same position. I tried taking photos a few times with my cell phone, but the distance and lighting always made the figure look like just a dark, undefined blob in the photos. Richard began to notice my growing obsession with the kitchen window at that time and suggested I find some activity to distract myself. But how could I ignore something so strange happening literally in my backyard? The situation got worse when, one Wednesday, Emily came running up to me during breakfast, saying that she had seen the tall man through her bedroom window. I froze. His room was on the 2nd floor, overlooking the same hill. When she said he was waving at her, I felt my stomach sink. It was the first time that anyone other than me had seen the figure make any kind of movement. That same afternoon, determined to get it over with, I got in the car and drove to the bottom of the hill, something that, interestingly, we had never done since we moved. The path was more difficult than it seemed from the house, with the terrain uneven and full of bushes. When I finally reached the spot where I always saw the figure, there was nothing but tall grass and some rocks. But what made me run back to the car was finding, stuck in the ground, a piece of paper with our initials written, EJSR, Emily, Josh, Sarah, me, and Richard. That night was the first night I couldn't sleep well. I went over everything in my head, trying to find some logical explanation for what was happening. The local police wouldn't be much help. What would I say? That there was a mysterious man who appeared and disappeared, and who left a paper with our initials. They would probably think it was some bad joke or that I was being paranoid about the change. Even so, I started researching the history of the region on the internet. I discovered some old reports from residents about the Watchman of the Hills, but they were vague stories, the kind that every small town has. What caught my attention was a comment on a local forum mentioning that, in the 80s, a family had moved and left after just 3 months living in the same area, without giving explanations. The next day, for the first time since it all started, the figure appeared earlier, around 3 p.m. And it was different. Not just the time, but the position. It was now closer to our house, maybe 50 meters closer than usual. I picked up the binoculars Richard used to watch birds and, with shaking hands, tried to focus in that direction. What I saw made my blood run cold. Even from a distance, I could see that the figure was wearing an old black suit like those from the beginning of the 20th century. But what scared me most was that, where the face should have been, there was only a dark, undefined spot. It was as if that part simply didn't exist or was blurred, like a defective photo. I dropped the binoculars on the ground, and at that moment Josh started shouting from the backyard. I ran outside so fast I almost tripped on the porch steps. Josh was standing in the middle of the yard, pointing at the hill with an expression of pure terror on his face. Emily was next to him, frozen, holding her soccer ball. When I looked where they were pointing, the figure was gone. But there was something different. All the grass at the top of the hill was bedded down, forming a perfect circle, as if something very heavy had pressed down on the ground. The scary thing is that I was absolutely sure that circle wasn't there minutes before, when I looked through the binoculars. Josh began to cry, saying that the faceless man had waved at him and then sunk to the ground as if he was melting. Emily confirmed the story, adding that, before disappearing, the figure had tilted its head in a strange way, as if its neck was much longer than normal. That night, I locked all the doors and windows, closed all the curtains, and called Richard, who was returning from a work meeting in town. I told him everything that had happened and, for the first time, he seemed genuinely worried. While I was waiting for him to arrive, I heard some strange noises coming from outside, as if someone was dragging something heavy across the lawn. The worst thing was that the noises seemed to be circulating around the house, but I didn't have the courage to look out the window. The kids were in my room watching TV at a high volume to try to distract themselves, but I could tell they were just as scared as I was. With each passing minute, the sounds got closer, until we began to hear what sounded like scratching on the outside walls of the house. They were slow, methodical scratches, as if someone or something was marking every inch of the house. The 2 hours that followed before Richard arrived were the longest of my life. The scratching continued, interspersed with moments of absolute silence that were even more frightening. At a certain point, all the lights in the house started to flicker, and the strangest thing is that even the cell phones started to fail, turning on and off by themselves. Emily began to cry when her tablet showed a completely black screen with small white dots that seemed to move, forming what looked like the outline of a face. Josh was curled up under the covers, shaking, saying he could hear heavy breathing coming from the hallway, even with all the doors closed. I tried to stay calm for them, but inside I was completely terrified, especially because I was also starting to hear that breathing getting closer and closer. When Richard finally arrived around 9 p.m., the noises had completely stopped. He ran into the house and found us all huddled in the bedroom. While I explained everything that had happened, he went to check the outside of the house with a flashlight. What he found made us decide to leave that same night. All the external walls were marked with strange symbols, which seemed to have been made with something sharp and deep. But the worst part wasn't the symbols themselves. It was the fact that they formed the exact same pattern as the wallpaper in the kids' room in our old New York City apartment. There was no way anyone could have known that. It was impossible. We packed our bags in record time and went to a hotel in the city, 40 minutes away. At the hotel, Richard finally admitted that he had also seen the figure a few times, but hadn't told me so as not to make me more scared. According to him, one morning, while he was drinking coffee before everyone woke up, he saw the man standing very close to the kitchen window, and what disturbed him most was that the figure seemed bigger than any normal person, with arms that reached almost up to his chest. Floor. He said he was paralyzed, watching, and that he had the impression that, even without a defined face, the figure was smiling. After that, we began to connect other strange events that we had ignored in recent weeks. The huge footprints that sometimes appeared in the yard after rain, the local animals that seemed to completely avoid our property, and the fact that no neighbors, however, even if we insisted, I never mentioned the hill, they always changed the subject. The next morning, we went back to the house to pick up some things we had left in our rush. The day was bright and sunny, which gave us a false sense of security. But as soon as we entered the yard, we noticed something that made our hearts stop. There were hundreds of papers scattered all over the lawn. When we got closer to look, we discovered that they were old black and white photos. In each of them, there was a different family in front of our house, all from different eras. Some appeared to be from the early 1900s. The most disturbing thing is that in every photo, without exception, you could see that same tall, dark figure in the background, always on the hill, always watching. And in the last photo, which seemed most recent, was our family, a photo we had never taken. But there were the four of us, smiling on the porch and behind that familiar silhouette on the hill. It was at that moment that Emily screamed, pointing towards the hill. There he was again, but this time in broad daylight and standing just a few meters from our house. The figure looked even more unnatural in the sunlight. It was as if it absorbed the luminosity around it, creating a sort of dark vacuum in the air. What impressed me most was its size. It must have been about 2.5 meters tall, and its arms were abnormally long and thin, swaying slightly even without wind. The dark spot where his face should have been seemed to pulse, as if he were breathing, and for the first time, we heard a sound coming from him, a low, steady hum that made our teeth hurt. Richard grabbed the kids and we ran to the car, but before we got in, the figure did something I'll never forget. He tilted his head at an impossible angle, almost a complete turn, and extended one of his arms towards us, as if inviting us to stay. Inside the car, as Richard drove as quickly as possible off the property, I looked in the rearview mirror and saw the figure shrinking in size until it disappeared completely, as if it were being sucked in by the air itself. That same afternoon, we contacted a real estate agent and put the house up for sale at the lowest possible price. We didn't go back there anymore. We asked a moving company to remove our furniture and belongings. The strangest thing is that, after we moved in, I tried to look for information about the history of the house and the area, but I found practically nothing. It's as if all records have disappeared. The only thing I discovered was a small newspaper clipping from 1923, mentioning that several families had moved from the area after reporting disturbing visions of a tall figure in the hills. Today, 5 years later, I still have nightmares about that figure. And sometimes, when I look out the window in the late afternoon, I have the terrible feeling that, even though I live on the other side of the country, that silhouette is still there, somewhere watching our family.